and I want to welcome you to this webinar on budgeting, plans, reports, and realities. This seminar is the first in a series of webinars presented in conjunction with the National Postal Forum. The next National Postal Forum is scheduled for May 21st through the 24th in 2017 at the Baltimore Convention Center in Baltimore, Maryland. Learn more at npf.org. Today I will be speaking with Mark Fallon, President and CEO of the Berkshire Company, about budgeting and how this impacts you and your company. If you have any questions during this webinar, please use the dialog box that appears in the GoToMeeting controls. In addition to covering the prepared remarks, we'll answer as many of those questions as time allows. So let's get started. Mark, there are different kinds of budgets, expense budgets and capital budgets. We need to understand the differences. Can you explain what type of budget is, what each type of budget is, and any difference between the respective budgeting processes?
Well, Jeff, thank you, and thanks to everybody who's attending the webinar today. Expense budgets in a lot of companies are also called operating budgets. This is the money that you either spend or bring in on a daily, weekly, monthly basis that keeps your business running. Capital budgets are investment budgets. This is when you invest money in a large piece of furniture, equipment, vehicle, building, whatever, and that investment has value. Over time, the investment will probably lose value, and you'll have to take depreciation costs, and we'll cover that later in the presentation. The way those two budgets are processed is slightly different. The operations budget, generally you put together once a year, and it's usually about this time of year. For most companies, they start budgeting in August, and then they formalize their budgets in September or October for the next year. A capital budget may follow the same cycle, but then again it may not, depending upon your company. The dollar amount for the capital budget can change depending upon the tax rules that impact your company in your industry. Small businesses like, say, for example, the Berkshire Company, we can use an investment as low as $2,000 as a capital budget. For very large companies, that amount will be larger, probably starting at around $10,000. The company and their accountants will decide what the right amount is for a capital budget.
Can you explain calendar year versus fiscal year?
Sure. For most of us, at least here in the States, the calendar year begins on January 1st and goes through December 31st of any given years. Most companies, that will be the same as your fiscal year. The fiscal year is the period that the company decides to use for the start of the budget year and the end of your budget year. Most companies, or at least most publicly traded companies, use January 1st to December 31st. The federal government uses October 1st as the beginning of their fiscal year and September 30th as the end of their year. Companies that do business with the federal government or are owned by the federal government, like the U.S. Postal Service, will follow that same fiscal year. Some states use July 1st as the beginning of their fiscal year and ending on June 30th the next year. For companies that do business with the states or affiliated for the exams, for example, a state college or university, will usually follow the same fiscal year as the state that they live in.
So when do I start working on my budget?
Actually, you never stop working on your budget, and I think that's what's really key. Too often, we fall into the trap of really working on our budgets only when we're asked to submit for the next fiscal year. And then we don't worry about it until we're either really out of whack with the budget or when the next year comes around and we start working on it again. What we like to encourage people is to constantly work on it and follow what I call in this presentation the budget cycle, where you're constantly looking at what's happening to your budget. The first step in the budget cycle is to find out what your actual volumes and costs are today. And that's really important. You always need to track, and that's not something you track once and then come back to 6 months or 12 months later. It's something that should be tracked on a daily basis, and expenses should be tracked on a weekly or a monthly basis. So that means you're tracking your inbound and outbound mail by type and class of mail. Now, why would you do that? Well, you know what? It costs slightly more to send out a piece of express mail than it does standard mail. So you want to make sure you're tracking by type. And it's the same with inbound. Hopefully, everyone on this webinar is handling accountable mail when it comes in differently than it handles periodicals or standard mail. Same for print and copy. Anything that you want to make sure you're doing, you're tracking the volumes by some type of category within the volumes. After you know your actual volumes and costs, the next thing you need to be looking at is what are your projected volumes? Is there going to be a change in the size of your business next year? Is your company expecting to grow significantly over the next quarter or over the next year? Or perhaps it's going the other way. Your company is going to shut down certain aspects of their business. So you may shrink over the next quarter of the next year. It's very important you stay in tune with what's going on with your company and how that may impact your projected volumes. The third step of the budget cycle is you start budgeting your expenses. And that's why I said, Jeff, it's constant. You should be constantly looking at your budget and what you'll be spending over the next month, quarter, and year. You need to think, what is this going to cost you? For example, we all know that rates will be going up in January. The Postmaster General has made that very clear. But what amount will they go up? We won't know for sure until the final figures come out for the rate of inflation, but we know that they will be tied to the rate of inflation. But they don't change by rate of inflation for each class. So you have to look at each category of your mail that you're spending out. So for example, in first class mail, they may raise their pre-sorted rates slightly higher than the rate of inflation and then raise the single rate slightly lower than the rate of inflation. I think we all should expect that this time around it's going to be aware of what's going on. Most people know what the price of a stamp is, but they don't know what the price of pre-sorted mail is. So you need to make sure you're tracking by category. We also saw that many of the other carriers are already announcing their rate increase. UPS has announced a rate increase that starts this December that depends upon what you ship will be somewhere between 4 and 9%. So what does that mean for all of us? You can expect FedEx will be announcing their rate increase very shortly, and it's probably going to be close to UPS. And lastly, we talked about changes in volumes. You need to know what type of equipment and software you need to process those volumes. Often equipment and software may be considered capital purchases. So even if you're going outside the budget cycle, you want to make sure you're thinking about what you're going to need for the future. And then, of course, the most expensive part of your budget, what labor force do you need to accomplish that work? You need to track that as well and start considering who you're going to need to run this equipment and run this software.
Now that we understand that the budget process is ongoing, what types of things should be included in my budget?
Well, on the categories page, I list some of the major areas. The first two, salary and benefits, is probably going to be somewhere between 30 and 50% of your budget. So when you say that people are our most important asset, well, financially, it definitely is. So you need to make sure you're tracking salaries and benefits. Next will be your direct expenses, and I'll cover that in just a second. Any allocated expenses are expenses you have very little control over, but are allocated to your department from a higher level within the company. That may include rent, utilities, depreciation of equipment, or depreciation of a building. It may even include other allocated expenses like training, human resources, any generally used department may be allocated back. The service charges from your company, you may be charged internally for facilities management services, waste management services, etc. And then, of course, your capital purchases. Excuse me. You want to make sure that you're including those over time. Your direct expenses for your operating budgets will include travel, because hopefully all of you are planning to attend the National Postal Forum, stationery printing for your department, postage for your department, and then of course postage for your company. On telephones and equipment, that may include internet expenses, and then lastly, maintenance. This is another large part of our budgets. You need to think about association dues, educational requirements. Obviously we may not charge for these webinars, but there may be other projects or other events that you want to attend that there will be expenses for. And one of the things that's not in here is the postage overall. Your responsibility is to maintain the postage budget, but you probably, as mail operations managers, have little control over the volumes that go out. So you need to make sure that you're monitoring that and that you're monitoring the rates. You need to look at what classes of mail you're going out and how they'll be impacted by the postal rate changes in 2017.
So with all this, what kinds of data should I really be tracking?
You need to think for your operation what you're going to track. Every operation has slightly different responsibilities, so you need to make sure you're looking at your responsibilities. If you mostly handle inbound and outbound mail, you better be tracking how much mail you receive and what type. You need to be tracking how many pieces you send out, what type of mail you send out, how many machine hours it takes to do that, vendor expenses, etc. And you have to think about how you're going to gather the data. That part could be difficult. If you're tracking inbound mail, how are you going to do that? Are you going to count trays, tubs? Hopefully you're not going to try to count every piece of mail every single day, but you know what? In some cases, you may want to do that, especially if you're tracking inbound checks. If you have an inbound sorting machine, it can do that for you. Then you have to think about how you're going to generate a report. You should have daily, weekly, and monthly reports. A daily report is important for you to see what's going on, but it may not be something you want to share with your boss. You may only want to give your boss a monthly or even a quarterly report. And you better make sure you sit down and explain to them what the numbers mean, because a production report to you could be detailed and only you'll understand it. If you were like I was when I worked in corporate America, my boss, well, my last job was the chief of corporate security, and he didn't even know anything about mail. In another company I worked for, it was the chief financial officer. He was looking at it differently as well. They didn't understand pieces, machine hours, clicks, etc. So I had to make sure I sat down with them and explained the report. You have to think about your audience and how they're going to use the report.
Mark, I'm not as technically savvy as you are with computers. So what's the easiest way for me to track the information?
Well, whenever you can, you still need to use some type of computerized system. And what do I mean by computerized? It may be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet like the one we're sharing with the audience. And you can log into that every day and put in how many trays and tubs. Or it could be an accountable mail tracking system where you're scanning every piece and it shows you when you received it and when you delivered it. So now you also have your labor costs and how long it takes to handle those pieces. If you're tracking outbound mail, your printers have tracking on them, your inserters have tracking on them, and of course your metering equipment has tracking. So all of those will give you detailed numbers on pieces, sides, pages, etc. And those should be able to tie it into a computer system. Some of them are sold by vendors you bought the equipment from, and some are sold by third-party vendors. You want to do everything you can to grab that information electronically so that it's accurate. If you have to rekey information, there's an opportunity for, well, I like to call it the fat finger mistake. Well, because I have fat fingers, and I can accidentally punch in a wrong number, and it's not adding, additional time. You need to make sure that if you're going to have a system that's generating information, that it's compatible with your accounting department, your controllers, your data management department, whatever they call themselves, because you're going to have to pass it along to them. You should work with your IT department and with your finance department before you invest in the system to make sure it's compatible with the rest of your company. In fact, most companies have some type of back-end and some type of database management system. Now, if you're older like me, you may be familiar using Microsoft Access or DBase, something like that. However, many of us aren't comfortable working in the database format. That's why a lot of people use Excel. If you're more comfortable with that, use it. Is there a difference between databases and spreadsheets? For producing reports, maybe not so much. But if you're tracking very large volumes of information, databases will always be better. So you want to choose what you're comfortable with and what's going to provide the best information long term. You know, and Jeff, you talked about not being technically savvy. Well, if somebody isn't, you know, perhaps you can only read a spreadsheet and you can't create a spreadsheet or create a pivot table. If you can't do this, hire people who can. When I was at State Street, I actually created a position called the Manager of Mail Automation. And her job was to be proficient in databases and spreadsheets and create the reports I needed to be the manager. I mean, I'm proficient, but I was nowhere near her level of expertise. Don't be afraid of hiring people who are smarter than you. Actually, I think hiring people who are smarter than you is a smart move.
So there are actual systems that are available for purchase that can help me with my budgeting process and tracking my data.
There are, and there's more coming out every day. Most of the systems are originally built around tracking data. So you'll have to import that into a budgeting software. You should not go out and buy any budgeting software on your own unless you own your own business. You should be working with your accounting department and comptrollers on what type of budgeting software they use. Remember, it goes back to choosing a system. You want to make sure it can automatically feed into the budgeting system. And most of the equipment vendors, Xerox, IBM, Kodak, OSE, on the printer side, Pitney Bowes, Bowie Bell & Howell, Kern, etc., they can all track this information, and the same with the meter manufacturers. Or you may decide to use third-party software, like, for example, Ironside's technology, that will pull the information from those systems and give you one overview. And today, what's amazing is, with all the different ways of using cameras, you can track everything that takes place within your department.
We talked a little bit earlier. You mentioned that oftentimes salary and benefits are the largest portions of our operating budgets. Are there any other areas where you might have a large expense in your budget?
Probably the largest expense after people is going to be your equipment maintenance. If you're going to be having a lot of equipment and you're paying maintenance on that, it can range from anywhere to 8 to 16% of the value of your equipment. So you need to make sure you have a clear understanding of your maintenance costs and how you're controlling that expense. And that depends upon your individual company and what you're producing. If you lease equipment, that's an operating expense. Many companies are moving away from capital purchases and moving towards leasing, because you can lease generally anything. You can lease computers, inserters, mailing machines, and of course your postage meter. So lease, like a maintenance, will probably be a significant part of your budget. I do want to share something we learned from one of our customers last month, that the IRS has announced changes taking place in 2019 that certain leases will be treated as debt with a 2-year look back. So that may impact whether your company wants to buy or lease today, and it's another good example of why you need to involve your finance department in your purchase decisions.
I hear people talk about cost per piece. What do they mean, and how is it calculated?
Cost per piece is something I think that for many of us who've been around the industry for a long time is relatively new. It didn't become really popular and standardized until the 1990s. And I think we were driven by the outsourcing companies because they capitalized on this as a measurement and a sales tool. And I think that's a good thing for our industry. All a cost per piece is you take your total expenses, divide it by the unit measurement, and boom, it gives you your unit cost. Now that sounds like a simple formula, but if we go to the next page, you can see a lot of things need to go into that. Your salaries, all of your salaries, even yours. If you're a manager, you know, it's not just the operators that are in your department. Part of your salary has to go into the cost per piece as well. And, you know, your admin goes in there. Maybe even your boss. We had one client that went as far up as their senior vice president, and a small portion of her salary went into this formula. So then you need to put in all of your direct expenses that we talked about earlier, and this all adds up to what your total expenses are. And excuse me, and this is real, you know, the sample that we have is a high level, but this works and shows you need to calculate your print costs, your inserting costs, and give you a total cost per piece. You want to make sure that this is appropriate, that you work with your accounting department on it, and that it works. Because you know what? Vendors are going to come in and sell your company on cost per piece. And that can be a facilities management outsourcer that wants to come in and run your operation, or perhaps a mail service provider or a print service provider. A lot of times they're going to bypass you and go directly to your senior management and be talking about cost per piece. So when your senior management comes to you, you better know this answer.
When you're dealing with allocated costs or even your operating budget, we talk about chargebacks. Can you tell us what those are?
Sure. Chargebacks allows you to go back to the business units that you're processing the mail for. And we're going to go forward a couple of slides here and talk about how you want to do that. You can skip over your equipment and staffing and move right to chargebacks. And that's when you go to your business units and charge them for postage as well as the use of your equipment. This is why you want that automated system. When you develop chargebacks, what's really great is you're tracking the pieces you're doing by department, and that's good for them to know what they're doing, and good for you because you know your performance. I believe the best benchmark for any unit is their past performance. So a chargeback system will allow you to track what you've been done previously and allow you to summarize and then send out a bill to your clients. And I really think that you need to think about the businesses, your business people, the other departments, as your internal clients. You may decide you're going to use a system that tracks per piece, or you may not be able to afford that. If you work for a very small company, you may want to use something like a percentage method. I worked at a small property casualty insurance company in the early 90s, so what we did is we measured the inbound mail, and we figured how much was going to accounting, how much was going to underwriting, and broke out the expenses by that. So we knew that underwriting was responsible for 70% of the mail, claims for 20%, so we allocated our expenses out on that percentage basis. However, the better way to do that is to accurately track a system that has it down to the per pieces that you do for each department.
How are actual chargebacks different then from allocated chargebacks?
Well, it's specific. You know, allocated is a round number and it may not accurately reflect. Some departments, again, smaller companies are not only concerned with that. But the larger companies, especially if they're publicly traded under Sarbanes-Oxley, if they're covered under Sarbanes-Oxley, they have to be able to show the exact cost of delivering their products. And by the way, mail is part of delivering the product. So you want to make sure that it's extremely accurate. Also, if you work for a utility company, they have to be accurate because the bill is part of delivering the service.
When you talk about budgets, we hear the word variance. What is a variance?
A variance is different from what you actually spent to what you were budgeted to spend. So we're going to include, when we post this online, an article I wrote called V is for Variance. And I would ask people to take some time after the webinar to read the article because I speak on it some more. But when you're looking at variances, you're going to see two things. One is how many dollars you were off, but also the percentage of your budget that you were off. The actual dollars, believe it or not, is usually not as important as the percentage. Now, why would I say that? Well, when I was at State Street, I had a $10 million annual budget. If I was off by $1,000, that's about 1/10 of 1%. Wasn't really important to my senior management. But when I was at Plymouth Rock, I only had a $10,000 budget. So if I was off by $1,000, that's 10%. That's really significant. So you always want to look at the percentages. The percentages tell you a lot. For example, if postage rates go up higher than expected, or for some reason your company produced 30% more work, you will be seeing a correlation and a representation of that change in your budget. So look at the percentages and try to recognize what caused that. And by the way, a positive variance, meaning you're under budget, still means you were wrong. You know, oh, we spent less, we're right. No, it meant you were wrong. Now, it's generally a wrong that doesn't get you into trouble, but you still need to explain it, and you need to make sure you can explain your positive and your negative variances.
So how do I explain the positive and negative variances?
Well, what caused it? You know, you'll see that, you know, this, what we're sharing today, which is an actual report from a company, you'll see that the variance on salaries was 28%, and it's 28% lower. What caused that? Well, it may be that they were short-handed, and they're going to fill in that person later on. Or it may be that benefits were far less expensive, or perhaps more expensive. So you need to make sure what causes it. You know, was it the number of people, an unknown expense? Or it could be you misallocated expense, that you thought something was going to be less than it was, or significantly more, and you're able to get it for less. You know, and I call this, when you're looking at your variances, the man in the mirror moment. When you look at the mirror, you need to be completely honest. Why weren't you accurate? You need to be honest with yourself, and then honest and upfront with your management. This is a great time to report to your management any significant events you see happening for the rest of the year. For example, if you look at the postage report, because in addition to responding for individual departments, we responded for overall corporate postage, you'll see that the year for the date for the company, they've spent a lot of their postage budgets already. What caused that? And is something else going to happen? Was it accounting? Was it billing? Was it claims? Is something different happening in your company that you didn't prepare for? What often happens with a lot of people is the company will come out during budgeting times and say, everybody has a flat budget for next year. So if you have $34,000, you know, it's going to be $34,000 a month for the entire year. However, we all know that's not the way mail works. You may have highs and lows at different times. So you need to make sure you're prepared to say what happened this month and how you predict that may occur or influence what's going to happen in the upcoming months. So I have to stress again and again, this isn't about making excuses. It's about being honest about what you're doing, what caused it. Because if you're honest now, when your next budget cycle starts and you're asking for an increase, they're going to listen to you.
Which also goes back to the importance of how you track the information, because that will help you explain those variances.
Absolutely, Jeff. Especially if you replaced a back of the napkin type of something by an accurate system and you have better numbers, that's a good thing for you today.
We're looking at a monthly reports. Can you help me understand the financial reports that you usually see from the finance systems?
So this is one where you need to sit down with your individual controller. I've worked for, as a salaried employee, 6 different companies in my professional career, and the financial reports in each company were significantly different. As consultants, we've worked with tens of companies, and I've yet to see 2 financial reports that look the same. And I've taken graduate level courses in finance, and often I need help understanding them. So I can't give you a general, this is what this term means, because I don't know the labels they're using at your company. This is where asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of intelligence. Find somebody in accounting and finance and ask for them to sit down with you and explain what each line means. It may take you a half an hour. It may take you a half a day. Bring coffee and donuts. I love them both. Maybe you want to bring lunch. Maybe you want to take them out to dinner because they've been so helpful. But whatever you do, make sure you sit down with somebody from your company and have them explain your report to you.
Okay, what kind of time frame should I be looking at when reviewing my budget? Monthly, quarterly, year-to-date?
Monthly, yes. Quarterly, yes. Year-to-date, yes. You need to look at what happened that month and what did you plan on happening. I love quarterly reviews because they often reveal some type of trend for you. Something that happens over 1 month, it could be, well, a blip. Something that happens over 3 months, that's going to show a trend. So I strongly recommend you look at quarterly. And then, of course, on your year-to-date, where are you and where did you expect to be when your fiscal year ends? That's really important. As a small business owner, it's something that I do on the 2nd day of every month. I don't do it on the 1st because that's when we send out bills. But after I've sent out the bills, I look at what happened that month, what we budgeted for, and where am I year-to-date and where am I going to. That's why I talked to you before when we start doing this. And when do we stop doing it? Well, it never stops. You need to be constantly looking at where you are and where you're going to. So monthly again, quarterly again, for trends, and then year-to-date as, the remainder of the year.
Oftentimes, companies have an annual budget process, but they may also sit down and try and do a forecast, where they look at the budget and then they forecast where they think it will end up. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, this is taking year-to-date 1 step further. In other words, your budget report may have 3 columns: budget, actual, and forecast. So you look at, this is what we're budgeted. We're in September now, so we'll say the 4th quarter. What have you budgeted for October, November, and December? Based on year-to-date, what do you want to change? You aren't going to change the budget, but perhaps you're going to add something. You might be able to get a variance accepted for you. We're going to forecast on what this means and what much we're going to spend on employees, how much we're going to spend on leasing and maintenance, and how much we're going to spend on postage. That's what forecasting means. It's taking all that you learned from year-to-date and using that to project forward.
Companies usually have a monthly accrual process. Just what is an accrual and what is the benefit of doing accruals?
So on this slide, I'm going to break one of the cardinal rules of presenting and read it from you, because these are financial rules. It's something that doesn't exist in the real world when you do your budget at home. It only exists in corporations and governments as far as I can see. So I'd ask you to follow along. An accrued expense is the opposite of a prepaid. Sometimes you may pay for a service and then you're going to receive that service later. That's prepaid, like, for example, a phone card. You may go to Walmart or a machine at the airport and you pay for that phone card up front, and then you keep using that card until it runs out. An accrued expense is when you get the service even if you're going to pay for it later. And that's what companies simply do, is they incur the expense on their budget even if they haven't gotten the bill yet. So they've used the service, for example, you've used a printing service in this month of September, but you're not going to get the bill until October. You see this in printing, postage, and even in wages. So, especially on jobs that take place at the end of the month, often for people we do consulting for. We do consulting in the month of September, and they don't get billed until October. So you put the expense on your ledger this month, even though you receive the bill next month. So it's on your balance sheet differently from the time that you incur the expense to when you're going to actually have to pay for it. So your company all have different rules. So this is another one where you need to make sure you sit down with your accounting department and your comptroller. Do they even allow accrued expenses? A lot of organizations don't. But if they do allow accrued expenses, how are they going to be presented on the budget? And then when the bill comes in, how do you make sure it goes back and hits September's numbers and not October numbers? Otherwise, you may get hit twice on your balance sheet. That's not a good thing. So this is an accounting principle. You need to make sure that you understand how your company applies it.
Okay, let's say I'm a new manager and I just started a new job and it's time to do next year's budget. The previous manager doesn't have any detail or history information, and the staff doesn't have a clue on what the goals are for the upcoming year. How do I project next year's budget?
Well, this is something that's happened to me a lot in my career, and as a consultant, it's something that happens more often than we would like. Often we're brought in to help people to get through this type of problem. The key here, as I've said before, is asking for help. The first thing to do is sit down with your manager, your executive, and determine what are their goals and your goals. You know, what are her goals for the upcoming year? Because what you're going to need to do is support those goals. They may be financial goals. In other words, she wants to reduce expenses by 5%. The goals may be production-wise. She wants to increase production by 5%. They may be significantly different. She may want to change the way you process mail and make it more quality control-oriented organization. So you need to talk with your manager first. Next, you go to your accounting. Raise your hand and say, I don't have any historical information. Can you provide me the historical background for the last 3 years? And I do recommend you go back 3 years to look for trends. And then ask, is there a projected budget for next year? Accounting, I find, generally like it when someone goes in and genuinely asks for help. Not just going in and arguing or making excuses, but asking for help. Meet with the purchasing department to go over the contracts. Do your contracts already have built-in restrictions or built-in cost increases? For example, you may have a printing contract that states each year the price cannot go up more than 5%. Or you may have a contract that says each year your costs actually need to go down. And we've been able to negotiate that type of contract in the past. So you need to meet with purchasing, discuss what contracts you have with your major vendors. Then after you've met with purchasing or your contracts, call your vendors in and talk about pricing, especially expected rate increases. You know, Jeff, in your example, you said your staff wasn't aware of what's going on. Don't make the mistake of the previous manager. Meet with your staff. Ask them what they think is going on, and then show them what you've done. I'm always amazed by the number of managers who never share the budgeting process with their staff, especially the next in line, their supervisors and their leads. I think it's really important that you sit down with your staff and show them the budget. Your budget may call for a cut in staff. Why aren't you being honest with your staff and letting them know what's going to happen? I think it's really important to be upfront and honest because you may not be around tomorrow. If you win the lottery tonight, I don't know what it is, but let's just say it's over $100 million. Well, Jeff, I'm hoping that you will come to work tomorrow, but for most people, they won't. And I'll be honest, if I win $100 million tonight, I would probably gently tell all my customers the Berkshire company will be closing in the next couple of months. Because that's a lot of money to me, people. I'll be honest with that. But you also need to be serious. Something serious could happen to someone. Someone could have a car accident. Someone could have a serious illness. Or they could pass away. So you don't want to make the mistake of the previous manager. You want to share the budget process with your staff and meet with them. You talked about budget reviews. Well, on a monthly basis, go over the budget with your staff. Meet with them on a quarterly basis. Go over the budget with them. Meet with them on a yearly basis and go over the budget with them. Share the information with your staff.
I've heard this term zero-based budgeting. What is that?
Zero-based budgeting was an interesting idea from the 1970s, and it means that you go back and build your operation from the beginning. So how many people do I need to run this operation? What type of equipment do I need to run this operation? What are the expected volumes of mail? What type of mail do you need to process, and how would you do that? So basically, you're going to build from the ground up and justify every part of your operation. This is a very important exercise when there's going to be a significant change in the type of business. Just this week, we heard some certain news about things that were going on with banks. Mm-hmm. And those departments are now going to have to justify everything they do. They're going to have to produce monthly information on how they're meeting their goals legally. So what are they going to need to do that? And the second reason is there may be a change in leadership. New management comes in and they want to know, why are you doing this? Why do you need 5 people instead of 4? Why do you need all of this equipment? Why do you need all of this software? And that's the most common place where zero-based budgeting comes into play.
Well then, there's also incremental budgeting.
Right, and that's where incremental budgeting is, where are you today and how will you add or subtract to that and why. It can be an incremental increase or decrease. So you start with the status quo and you slightly adjust it based upon forecasts and trends for the future. And that's where most of us use in corporate America. So our budget today is $10,000 and you need to know what's going to be the increase next year. So you already know, because of UPS, that shipping's going up. You know that postage is going up. You know that health benefits are probably going to be going up. So you have to find a way to make those adjustments. Or they may just say you're allowed to increase your budget 2 to 3%, some flat amount. And that's another very common practice in corporate America.
So is one any better than the other?
Well, I wouldn't say one is better than the other. I mean, I think that companies on a regular basis should go through the zero-based budgeting process. It's not enjoyable in any way, shape, or form. The first time I had to go through this, I was much younger than I was now, and I didn't understand why I had to do it. I was a young supervisor, and I told my boss, this is crazy. We're not changing our business. Why are we going through this? Well, senior management did have a change, and they wanted to know why their company was doing things. So I think it's a great question. If you were starting your operation from scratch today, if you could wipe everything out and start all over again, how would you do it? Now, what some companies find out, and they don't like to hear this, if they were doing if they were processing their mail the way they should have been doing it, it will cost them slightly more. However, that generally means they're going to produce higher quality mail, which means fewer calls to customer service, fewer complaints, and that costs a lot more than postage. A call to customer service for an average company ranges from $7.50 to $8.50. That's a lot of money for a piece of mail. So you may want to increase your mailing budget that offsets expenses somewhere else. So again, I do think the zero-based budget process is something that's worth going through on a regular, well, at least a periodic basis. 2 caveats. I don't think you should do it every year. The second is when you do it, take it to heart and really look at why you're doing things the way you are.
So what kind of opportunities are there for savings?
Well, we're talking about budgeting, and I think that we don't always spend enough time on where can we save money in the budget. We don't want to have to cut our budgets every year, but often we will have to cut our budget. So we want to look at wherever we can save money for our department, save money for our internal customers. So whatever you can automate, automate. How you track information, how you process your mail, automate, automate, automate. How can you truly maximize your discounts? When we moved into shape-based pricing a few years ago, some companies took the lead and they changed their flats and turned them into letters, just by changing the fold. A 6x9 envelope is what? A letter. So you can significantly reduce your postage discounts. Also, we see that what probably is going to happen in 2017 is 3-ounce letters will get the same automation discount as 1-ounce letters. Are you sending out 9 pages in a flat today that you could turn into a 6x9? So whatever you can, maximize your postage discounts. Also, are you mailing at the right class? Does the piece have to go out at first class, or could it go out at standard? Over the last couple of years, we've seen the Postal Service have different promotional campaigns. You should maximize those discounts. Use consolidators. Use pre-sort vendors. And by the way, just because you have a contract with a vendor, 2-year, 3-year, 5-year contract, and you're in the middle, it doesn't mean you can't go back and renegotiate. You should constantly be looking at your contracts. Is your vendor performing as well as they expected? Can you renegotiate with them for better pricing or perhaps better service? Perhaps your pricing can't change, but the service levels can. That's still a savings. You should constantly be looking at how your mail center is set up. Are you maximizing how your space is utilized? Are you maximizing how your equipment is utilized? Here's a spot where your staff can really help out. I help people design mail centers, and I've even brought in professional process engineers. We once designed a very large mail center, spent a couple of $1 million on the building. Within 1 week, the staff came to us and said, do you realize that we moved those tables at a certain angle, from I think they were at 60 degrees to 90 degrees, that we can increase efficiency? And they walked me through it. It didn't cost us anything, but we brought the staff in and we made that change and we allowed them to be more efficient. So just because you've spent a lot of time designing a mail center doesn't mean you're done. Just as with your budget, you should be looking at it constantly. Look at the training for your staff. Now I know that most people on this webinar will not receive a budget increase for training this year, but with all the new postal regulations, the intelligent mail barcode, the mailer's scorecard, and stricter enforcement of move update, well, your staff needs to be aware of this, and it doesn't have to cost you a lot of money. You may want to do it yourself. If you're a manager, you've gone through your MDP certification, and you can walk this through your staff. You can bring in a mail piece design analyst from the Postal Service. One of the things people don't realize, the Postal Service's training is free. So bring those people in. You may want to bring in your account manager. This webinar is going to be shared with you as a PDF and as a video. Why not share that with your staff? It doesn't cost anything. So I think on the people side, it's very important to share with your staff. Where can you use temps instead of full-time employees? You may have the first week of the month or the last week of the month when you have the greatest volumes, or maybe seasonal. Also consider using part-time staff. I can't emphasize this too much. I used to use high school students. They would finish school at 2:30 or 3 o'clock and then come to work for me from 3 to 5 or 3 to 6. I'm only paying 2 to 3 hours for a high school student instead of 2 hours plus benefits for a full-time employee. And now that student is getting exposure to the business world. It's a great opportunity for everyone. You see a lot of parents now, they used to be called mother's hours, now they're called parents' hours because they're stay-at-home dads. And they can only work in the middle of the day. This may be great for you because you have to cover for lunch, training, all the other things that could be happening. And of course, cross-train your staff. A great way to increase your number of operators without increasing the number of your employees is to train people who aren't operators to be operators. You shouldn't have specialists. You should have general specialists. In other words, yes, they may run the inserter regularly, but they also know how to run the meeting machine and they know how to run the front window. And you need to educate your customers. One of my favorite things to do when I was a kid was to go and see my dad when he worked, because he was a postal clerk. And I still love to go to the Postal Service on late Saturday mornings, because on Saturday afternoon the postal office is closed. They always have been. They close at noon. And if you go there at 11:30 on a Saturday morning, there's often a line out the door because A, The Postal Service hasn't done a really good job on educating their customers what the hours are. And B, when people get to the front of the line, they don't know what they want to do. They know that if they go to Starbucks, they want a half cap, double shot, espresso latte, no whip with skim milk, but they don't know if they want to send something media mail, priority mail, express mail, and then the clerk has to educate them. Well, doesn't the same thing happen within your own company? Does marketing know what the postal rules are? Does accounting know what the postal rules are? Your job as a manager is to go out and educate them. And then, of course, reward your employees. That may cost money, but they're going to be more motivated, and they'll help find you ways to save money. When you have a chance to reward them, it doesn't have to be multi-billion-dollar bonuses. It could be as much as shaking their hand and saying sincerely, thank you. You may be buying lunch for the group. It doesn't have to be a huge amount of money, but people like to hear the words, thank you, especially when they're sincere.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, we're just about out of time. Do you have any closing statements?
Well, I just want to very briefly go over the slide about promoting your successes. If you're successful in your budget, you need to make sure that you're telling your management that you're successful. Make sure you highlight any savings you have, and even if you're just on budget but you're improving service, tell your senior management. Also, I'm recommending that you should get published and promoted externally. If there are local PCC events, regional conferences, the National Postal Forum, you want to make sure that you are included in that. And Susan, we just had a question come in. I want to make sure I read it properly before we go through here. But budgeting isn't a lot of fun, but if you get published and you get recognized, you can probably have a lot of help with people. So we have a question come in. I just want to take a second to read it. When setting your budget for the next year, should taxes be added to your budget numbers on materials and services? Yes, you definitely need to make sure that you include taxes. If taxes apply to your corporation, we have corporations that we work with that are nonprofit. So some of the taxes hit them, some of the taxes don't. This goes back to the original thing of sitting down with your finance person, sitting down with your comptroller, and have them look at your numbers. That's a great question. Thank you.
Yes. Mark, thank you very much for the information you shared with us today. I would also like to thank our listeners. If you have any additional information or would like any additional information, please visit our website at www.berkshire-company.com. We look forward to seeing everybody at the National Postal Forum in Baltimore, Maryland. If you register before March 1st, 2017 and book your room through the NPF, you are eligible to receive at least $240 off a full site registration fee. To learn more about the registration options and opportunities to save, visit www.npf.org for details. Until then, thank you very much and goodbye.